The deserts of North Africa, unforgiving, endless, and echoing with the clash of steel. Amid the thunder of Allied armour and the relentless march of war, two Italian machines still roll onto the battlefield. The M1340 and its successor, the M1441. Small, outgunned, outdated, many dismiss them as obsolete, relics destined for defeat. But in the chaos of desert combat, even relics could bite. Behind their thin armour and humble guns lies a hidden story. A story of adaptability, of determination, and of how these ageing tanks could still challenge the might of Allied mediums. Today we step into the dust and fire of history to uncover the last stand of the M1340 and M1441. Even when a tank is considered obsolete on paper, it can remain a dangerous presence on the battlefield. In the unforgiving landscapes of the North African desert during the Second World War, crews often fought in machines that were rapidly being outclassed by the technological leaps of the Allies. By the middle stages of the campaign, Italian mediums such as the Fiat Ansaldo M1340 and M1441, once serviceable vehicles when first fielded, struggled desperately against thicker armoured opponents. Likewise, the German Panzer III, the backbone of the early Blitzkrieg victories, now found itself facing opponents far more powerful than the lightly armoured British cruisers or slow-moving Matildas armed with only the 2-pounder gun it had once countered. As the British and then the Americans brought in the M3 Grant and more decisively the M4 Sherman, the disparity in firepower, armour and reliability became pronounced. Yet to dismiss these inferior tanks as irrelevant is to underestimate the dynamics of desert warfare. A well-handled M1340 or Panzer III could still muster a sting if sprung from an ambush, fighting from prepared positions, or operating in numbers under clever tactical leadership. The open expanses of North Africa also meant that mobility, concealment and coordination with anti-tank guns, artillery and air support could magnify the threat posed by vehicles that were individually outdated. For the tank crews pressed into service against opponents their machines were never designed to confront, victory relied less on hardware and more on tactics, improvisation and determination. This tension between obsolescence and lingering battlefield relevance sets the stage for deeper analysis. How did Axis forces wring effectiveness from tanks already sliding into irrelevance, and under what conditions could an M1340 or Panzer III still challenge a Grant or even a Sherman? To answer these questions, we need to look closely at specific engagements, command decisions and the tactics that defined desert warfare when steel, dust and survival collided. The Italian M1340 and M1441 tanks faced several critical challenges in the North African campaign. While originally equipped with the 47mm Cannoni to 47-32 M35 gun that could handle early British cruiser tanks, their armour was thin and brittle, ranging between 30 and 42mm, making them vulnerable to heavier British and American tanks as the war progressed. Their diesel engines were fuel efficient and less prone to catching fire, but underpowered, limiting their speed and mobility in the harsh desert terrain. The bolted construction of these tanks and brittle armour that would shatter upon impact rather than absorb hits often put crews at great risk from internal spalling. The cramped interiors, lack of radios in many vehicles undermined battlefield effectiveness. But what is important is not just the tank, but the crew. The Italian and German crews of many of the tanks will be seasoned veterans, having fought through the campaign in the desert. But by the time the Allies introduced the M3 Grant and the M4 Sherman, the M1340s and M1441s were outclassed in almost every aspect. But with tactical ingenuity and numbers of tanks, it was possible for these tanks to get the upper hand. The German Panzer III shared some limitations as well, initially effective with its 37mm and later 50mm guns, but increasingly overwhelmed by the heavier armament and armour on Allied vehicles in the desert. Its medium armour and inferior firepower meant it had to rely heavily on tactical positioning and support to compensate against the Grant and Sherman tanks. The Italians, in response to these weaknesses, leaned heavily on the Semovente de 75-18, a self-propelled gun armed with a more potent 75mm howitzer, mounting a credible threat to M3 Grants and even Shermans. Its low profile and decent mobility allowed Italian forces to engage Allied tanks with more confidence, especially from ambush positions. Additionally, Italian defensive doctrine in North Africa emphasised combined arms, reflecting the necessity to compensate for less effective tanks. Artillery support was crucial, especially the dreaded 9053 anti-tank gun, derived from an anti-aircraft version, mounted on gun trucks, which doubled effectively as mobile anti-tank platforms, enabling Italian formations to contest Allied armour more effectively despite technical inferiority. This synergy of artillery, infantry and tank firepower was vital given the often isolated and precarious position of Italian armoured units. In essence, while the M1340, M1441 and Panzer III became increasingly obsolete, their crews could still wield a lethal impact by integrating with artillery and infantry support, exploiting terrain, and using tactical ingenuity to offset their hardware disadvantages. The Semovente 75-18 and artillery pieces like the 9053 were pivotal in creating a combined arms framework that prolonged the threat these older tanks posed against the modern M3s and Shermans of Allied forces. The Knightsbridge sector action on the 10th of June 1942, part of the broader Battle of Gazala, exemplifies how tactically astute use of effective vehicles like the Italian Semovente de 75-18, supported by the inferior M1340 tanks, could produce decisive results against more modern Allied armour, such as the M3 Grants. Initially deployed as mobile artillery, the 75-18 became effective for shorter range direct fire. These units would be backed up by formidable artillery in the form of gun trucks. In this engagement, the Italian 20th Army Corps, under the overarching Axis plan, was tasked with breaking through parts of the British Gazala line. The Semovente de 75-18, a self-propelled gun armed with a short-barrelled but powerful 75mm howitzer, was deployed in a defensive line and ready to target the M3 Grants. Its low silhouette and more effective firepower compared to the standard M1340 tank gun made it a potent threat against Allied armour, even those with heavier frontal armour like the Grants. The Semovente effectively knocked out numerous Grants by engaging from hull-down positions near ridges and dunes, capitalising on the open desert terrain to hide and then strike before Allied tanks could respond effectively. The low silhouette of the vehicles made it difficult for Allied tanks and artillery to target them and achieve direct hits. In the encounters south of the Knightsbridge box supporting the Semovente were M1340 tanks. They were placed in a defensive line, although not flat, more a convex line. The medium tanks would not advance. An adaptation from the doctrine would see them in more defensive positions, providing a screen in front of the Semovente. They would not be charging into armoured brigades equipped with M3 Grants unless they outnumbered them for a mass attack. I do not have sources on how many M13s are with the batteries of Semovente. I assume not that many. While their 47mm guns were less effective against Grants from the front, the M1340s in numbers allowed them to menace lighter British vehicles, disrupt infantry and corral enemy movements into kill zones covered by the Semovente and artillery. The Italians often used M1340s in combined arms style formations to screen the Semovente and gun trucks, absorbing counterattacks and distracting British tank crews who underestimated the threat. The original doctrine for tanks used as a breakthrough had to be ignored as the campaign drew on. M13s and M14s were not armed or armoured enough to perform this role when M3s were present, and later at El Alamein where Shermans and Churchills appear. Usually if the opposing brigade had light vehicles, could the Carro M tank spearhead an attack, an example being the action between the Trieste Division and the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade that took place just before the siege of Bir Hakeim. However, a smaller group of Grants could be vulnerable to a mass attack, which we will look at later. Additionally, the Italians relied heavily on gun trucks armed with the powerful 9053 anti-tank guns. mounted in mobile platforms that could unlimber to provide devastating anti-tank fire. These gun trucks were positioned to cover likely British armoured avenues of approach, providing overlapping fields of fire with the Semovente and M1340s. They may have been positioned with the Semovente or slightly behind. This interplay allowed the Axis to compensate for the technical inferiority of their tanks by creating layered defensive belts of firepower. Tactically, the Italian forces also made use of the terrain, arranging forces behind ridges in badlands and along the edges of minefields to funnel British tanks into constrained zones where their firepower advantage could be magnified. Defenders would dig in and camouflage their positions, waiting for the British Grants to advance into their effective range. The Semovente, the 75-18 stronger gun, was capable of penetrating the Grant armour at typical engagement ranges, while the 90-53 gun trucks could dominate open ground and key choke points. The combination of well-positioned Semovente, screens of M1340 tanks and mobile anti-tank artillery created a formidable defensive network in the Knightsbridge sector. This synergy of combined arms helped the otherwise outclassed Italian armour to secure a tactical edge against M3 Grants, forcing British armoured units to withdraw after sustaining heavy losses and contributing directly to Axis successes in the phase of the Gazala campaign around late May and early June 1942. The British lost 15 M3 Grants and 5 Stuarts across 2 regiments. Only 2 M1340s were lost for the Italians. This battle highlights how tactical positioning, use of terrain and combined arms doctrine could transform otherwise obsolete or inferior vehicles into effective battlefield threats by maximising their strengths and covering their weaknesses. This example showed that the M13 and M14 tanks were now deployed as defensive shields, a distraction, while the Semovente self-propelled guns provided direct anti-tank fire using its Effetto Pronto heat shell. Both the Ariete and Littorio armoured divisions received battery units of Semovente. An officer of the Duca d'Aosta artillery regiment of the Littorio division, part of a group of Semovente units, remarked about the vehicle in English translation: "This was a real fighting machine, which, thanks to its 75mm howitzer, earned the respect of all enemy armoured vehicles fighting at El Alamein. The high rate of fire, precision and range caused an expected fear in British tankers." The Italian 101st Motorised Division Trieste played a crucial and aggressive role in the Knightsbridge sector following the fall of Bir Hakeim in June 1942. According to British officer Captain Buxton's account and historical records, the Trieste Division launched a mass attack against British M3 Grant tanks, demonstrating how tactical ingenuity and use of superior numbers could overturn technological inferiority. The Trieste, although a motorised division, had a battalion of M1340s in its formation. In this particular engagement, 9 M1340 tanks and 8 armoured cars, presumed to be AB-41s, from the Trieste Division encircled approximately 10 M3 Grants and a Crusader tank, a squadron belonging to the 4th Hussars, who were to meet Captain Buxton and his unit of the 3rd County of London Yeomanry. Assumptions have to be made here, as there is a lack of detail on this encounter. Italian tank tactics with M1340s and armoured cars often emphasise manoeuvre warfare, involving the use of mobility of the tanks and reconnaissance armoured cars to flank and encircle enemy units. The M13s were not overly quick, but reconnaissance cars like the AB-41 certainly were. The vehicles could be used whilst exploiting terrain features to mask movement and close in on enemy tanks, conducting rapid, coordinated attacks to overwhelm the tank squadron that did not have a huge number of tanks. The Italian units sometimes lacked radios, limiting real-time coordination, and pre-planned manoeuvres compensated to some extent. Crews of the M1340 tanks would have to fire at close ranges. Many of them would have received training early on in their careers to fire at 400 metres, but by this time they would have to get in closer to damage a Grant and flank it to the sides and rear. I will attempt to show how this engagement would have looked with tactical positioning on my map. There are assumptions here. I don't have a great amount of detail to go on, only the description that it was an encirclement manoeuvre. I'm basing assumptions on the capabilities of the vehicles involved and tactical doctrine at the time. It is rapid manoeuvre combat, typical of desert warfare in North Africa. The M1340s would form the main attack and encirclement force around the Grants. They had more firepower and armour than the AB-41 cars. They would be the central combat unit, with the AB-41s on the flanks ready to push on and flank the Grants with speed. It is likely on the approach that the Italian armoured force is using sand, dust and any terrain features to mask the tanks and close in quickly. The formation probably split to encircle or flank the Grants and Crusader tank, closing off escape or reinforcement. The AB-41 armoured cars with superior speed would act on the outer flanks or rear approaches to screen the manoeuvre, exploit gaps and cut communications or retreat paths. The AB-41s most likely did not lead the frontal assault, but positioned themselves to rapidly exploit the battlefield mobility advantage and encircle the Grant squadron. They could break away and encircle. The AB-41's job is to flank, harass and try and cut off enemy retreats, confuse the crews of the M3 Grants and cause disarray amongst the squadron. Italian tanks and armoured cars could take advantage of the M3 Grant's main weakness, the main gun being fixed in the hull. The limited traverse of the 75mm would mean that the Grant has to slowly pivot on the spot. It was notably awkward for British crews to coordinate efficiently in these tanks. The secondary gun, the 37mm in the turret of the Grant, would be a danger, but the flanking manoeuvre, chaos and confusion would make it a difficult task for the gunner to hit targets. The AB-41s with their 20mm autocannons would not be used to penetrate armour, but to disable tracks and damage external fittings such as radio equipment and aerials, anything to isolate Grants and make them an easier target for the M13s. Command tanks of the squadron would be a high priority. The M1340s and armoured cars attacked in coordinated waves, surrounding and cutting off the Grants and the Crusader, which found themselves unable to concentrate fire or break out from the encirclement. With numerical superiority and surprise on their side, the Italians managed to knock out 9 Grants and 1 Crusader, a significant loss to the British armoured forces in the area. The Italians suffered no losses. This action was a prime example of exploiting tactical positioning and combined arms coordination to compensate for equipment limitations. The success of the Trieste attack underlined the importance of using terrain to mass movements and achieve surprise, especially for tanks that were otherwise outclassed individually. It also showed that even obsolete tanks, when employed en masse with good leadership and coordination, could still impose serious losses on better armed British tanks. The Italians' ability to mass their forces effectively and use terrain as a force multiplier provided a tactical edge in a campaign where armoured battles often depended on manoeuvre and ambush tactics as much as raw firepower. This case fits well with the pattern seen elsewhere in Axis tactics during the North African campaign, where exploiting terrain advantages often made the difference between success and failure for units equipped with inferior tanks. There is some scepticism about Captain Buxton's account. Firstly, was it the Italian M13 tanks and armoured cars alone, or were they supported by artillery? This seemed like a small company of tanks, so it is possible that they were alone without infantry and artillery in support. There is no detailed description, but there is that doubt that the tanks destroyed the M3 Grants alone. Secondly, the 4th Hussars war diaries claimed that German Panzer IIIs and 4s, along with 88mm anti-tank guns, defeated the squadron. Captain Buxton seems adamant that it was Italian tanks, and it seemed likely that it was the Trieste because the division was in that area around the north of Bir Hakeim. He is a surviving eyewitness of the action, and after was taken prisoner for a short time before escaping. Before we look at further examples of tactics for the Italians, we should analyse the Germans in North Africa. They were having problems too. The Panzer III and early models of the Panzer IV, equipped with the short-barrelled 75mm, faced significant challenges while deployed in the North African campaign. The Panzer III, widely used by the Afrika Korps, was generally armed with a 50mm Kampfwagenkanone 38L42 gun early in the campaign, with some carrying the older 37mm gun. While the Panzer III was adequate against lighter Allied tanks like the British Crusader or the American M3 Stuart, it struggled against the thicker armoured British Matilda II and especially the M3 Grant and later Sherman tanks, because its gun lacked sufficient armour penetration power at range. Additionally, the Panzer III's medium armour between roughly 30 and 50mm was increasingly vulnerable to the more powerful Allied tank guns, particularly the 75mm guns mounted on Grants and Shermans. This left Panzer III crews needing to rely on tactics and positioning rather than firepower or armour in direct confrontations. Also, some of the Panzer IV were earlier variants intended as an infantry support tank and were armed with the short-barrelled 75mm Kampfwagenkanone 37 gun, optimised for firing high explosive shells rather than armour-piercing rounds. While effective against infantry positions and fortifications, the gun struggled against enemy tanks with heavier armour. This was a major tactical problem since the British and Americans fielded increasingly well-armoured tanks like the M3 Grant and M4 Sherman. The low velocity of the gun meant limited accuracy and penetration against armour, especially at distance, making the Panzer IV vulnerable in tank-to-tank combat during the early years in North Africa. It wasn't until the introduction of the longer-barrelled 75mm Kampfwagenkanone 40 gun that the later Panzer IV variants regained parity in firepower. The first didn't arrive until May, just as the M3 Grant was arriving in the deserts of North Africa. These technical shortcomings created an operational necessity for combined arms tactics. The Panzer III and early Panzer IV could not rely solely on their own tank guns to defeat the newer Allied armour, and so had to operate in close coordination with other arms. Key among these were the deployment of the formidable 88mm flak guns, repurposed as anti-tank weapons. The 88mm gun was highly effective, capable of penetrating the thick armour of M3 Grants and Shermans at long ranges. In many battles in North Africa, the 88mm gun was the centrepiece of German anti-tank defence, positioned to cover likely Allied tank approaches and supported by infantry and tanks. The German doctrine, we know it as the Blitzkrieg, stressed the importance of integrating tanks, anti-tank guns, infantry and artillery into cohesive formations, allowing the Panzer III and IV to focus on rapid manoeuvre, exploitation and infantry support, while stationary or towed 88mm guns handled the heavy anti-tank role. Very similar to the Italians, who based their doctrine on the Germans' Blitzkrieg. The 88mm high velocity and excellent penetration compensated for the tank's weaknesses that allowed German armoured units to hold ground or break through superior numbers of Allied tanks. Here's an account from Captain Huth, an officer commanding an M3 Grant that came under attack in May 1942 east of Bir Hakeim, Panzer IIIs and IVs in a rapid manoeuvre attack backed up by 88mm guns. This might be upsetting for some viewers. We all opened up at once as the whole column appeared to do a right wheel and advanced directly onto us. Fighting lasted about 15 minutes, by which time all our tanks except 2 had been hit and put out of action. We had hit many enemy tanks, but at the time I could not estimate enemy losses, although I saw 3 or 4 go up in flames. My own tank had been penetrated by an 88mm after I had fired only 2 shots with the 75mm, and the driver, Lance Corporal Dixon, and the 75mm gunner, Trooper Prescott, were killed immediately. The 37mm also having been hit, we bailed out and 2 more of the crew were killed. I then managed to get on the back of 2nd Lieutenant Coleman's tank. By this time the squadron was retiring, firing at the same time, being completely outnumbered. By the end of 15 minutes, Captain Nelson had been wounded, and of the 3 troop leaders, David Elliott had been killed, Nigel Gibbs wounded and died within an hour, and Francis Coleman also wounded. There were about 12 wounded and 12 killed among the other ranks of the squadron. The limitations of the Panzer III and early Panzer IV in armour penetration and protection meant that success on the battlefield hinged on combined arms integration and tactical coordination. The 88mm anti-tank guns provided a vital counterweight to the growing armour threat from Grants and Shermans, reinforcing the essential lesson of North African tank warfare. Even technically inferior vehicles could remain effective if supported by complementary arms and tactical deployments. The Luftwaffe played a critical and multifaceted role in the North African campaign, providing indispensable support that often helped offset the limitations of Axis armoured forces such as the Panzer III and IV, as well as the Italian Carro M tanks. Operating under the command of Fliegerführer Africa as part of Luftwaffe Zur, the German Air Force in North Africa was integral to reconnaissance, close air support and interception duties that directly influenced many ground engagements. One of the Luftwaffe's key contributions was close air support for armoured and infantry units, including the Panzer divisions and Italian tank formations. German fighter and dive bomber planes would attack enemy tank concentrations, artillery positions and supply lines, disrupting the Allied formations before or during armoured clashes. This air cover helped Axis tanks to manoeuvre more confidently by suppressing British and American anti-tank guns or softening up infantry that might threaten vulnerable flanks. The cooperation between the German Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica was a critical element of Axis air operations in the North African campaign, especially as the intensity and scale of fighting increased from 1941 through 1943. While the two air arms operated distinctly under their respective commands, their collaboration evolved into a pragmatic partnership driven by operational necessity and mutual benefit. Initially, the Regia Aeronautica, though technically less advanced and often burdened by organisational challenges and supply issues, worked alongside the Luftwaffe to defend Axis positions and support ground operations. The Luftwaffe provided superior aircraft tactics and operational leadership, while the Regia Aeronautica contributed significant numbers of aircraft and valuable local experience. This collaboration included sharing airfields, logistics and intelligence, as well as joint mission planning to maximise air cover and ground attack capability. German units such as the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters often operated in tandem with Italian units flying Macchi C-202 Folgore and C-200 Saetta fighters, among others. Operational effectiveness never really improved under the Regia Aeronautica, but they did produce better planes during the campaign. For instance, the introduction of the Macchi C-202, the best Italian fighter in the theatre, boosted Regia Aeronautica's ability to contest the skies, achieving notable kill ratios during the crucial battles such as Bir Hakeim. Reconnaissance sorties flown by the Luftwaffe were equally vital, providing commanders like Rommel with timely intelligence on Allied movements and force dispositions. This enabled Axis forces to plan ambushes, mass attacks or probe defensive weak points with better situational awareness. Crucial in the wide open dynamic desert battlefields where visibility and surprise were tactical assets. Moreover, the Luftwaffe's efforts in interception of Allied supply lines and convoys hampered British and American logistics, which were already stretched thin across North Africa's vast desert expanses. This air interception helped slow the arrival of reinforcements and tanks, lessening the numerical advantage of the Allies. The Shermans' arrival signified a turning point in the North African armoured war, pressuring Axis forces into increasingly defensive postures and costly engagements. The adaptability of Italian units in deployment of anti-tank guns alongside German tactics prolonged Axis resistance, but ultimately was insufficient to stop the Allied advance. The M1340 and M1441 tanks, when faced with the arrival of Shermans, generally took more defensive positions rather than aggressive offensive roles. Due to their inferior gunpowder and armour compared to the Shermans, Italian doctrine emphasising breakthrough attacks with tanks was difficult to apply effectively against the new, better armoured Allied medium tanks. In practice, M13 and M14 crews often held defensive lines, utilising terrain to create kill zones or delay lines, and relied heavily on support from Italian artillery and Semovente 75-18 assault guns to compensate for their tanks' weaknesses in direct tank-to-tank combat. The M13s or M14s might attempt suppressed or opportunistic attacks, but their usual approach was caution and preservation, aiming to avoid direct head-on engagements with Shermans, except at very close range where their 47mm gun had some chance of effectiveness. Some tactics included firing at the Shermans' tracks and suspension to immobilise them, rather than attempting to penetrate the main armour, and coordinating with mobile anti-tank guns and artillery to create layered defences. The tanks would also conduct rearguard actions during withdrawals, trying to delay the Shermans' advance, while vulnerable Italian infantry and anti-tank units were repositioned. One notable encounter occurred during the Axis retreat at the Second Battle of El Alamein, an immense act of bravery from the crews of a company of 11 M1340 tanks, led by a remarkable commander. October 1942. The sands of El Alamein are shaking under the thunder of battle. The Axis lines are crumbling. British armour surges forward in unstoppable strength. For the Italian Alliata Armoured Division, battered and bleeding, the order comes: retreat, pull back, or be annihilated. But among these exhausted men, one commander refuses to go quietly. His name is Luigi Pascucci, Company Chief Lieutenant of the 132nd Tank Infantry Regiment belonging to the Alliata Armoured Division. Pascucci commands a steel Relic, an M1340 medium tank. By now it is obsolete, its gun too weak, its armour paper thin against the Shermans and Grants that roll across the desert. Inside, his crew know the truth. In a stand-up fight, they will not last a minute. And yet, Pascucci makes his choice. If Alliata is to escape, someone must hold the enemy back. That someone will be him. The engine roars to life, coughing out black smoke. The tracks grind against the hard desert floor, spraying sand and rock. Pascucci leans forward, his voice hard and steady.
Avanti, all'attacco!
The tank lurches ahead, building speed, charging into the teeth of the battle. British gunners spot the company of Italian tanks. Shells scream across the desert, explosions erupt left and right. Hot shards of steel batter the armour, ringing like a hammer on an anvil. Inside, smoke fills the crew compartment. The loader slams another round into the breach. The cannon cracks. A shot echoes across the battlefield, hitting dust, armour, anything in its path. The M1340 keeps moving, shaking violently, every plate rattling, but it does not stop. An obsolete tank against an armoured brigade, and still it charges. Another hit. The side shudders, flames lick the turret, but still they drive forward, one desperate dash to buy their comrades time. Each second bought, another Italian tank escapes, another soldier lives. Finally, the blow comes. A shell punches through, the M1340 erupts in fire. Smoke rises into the sky, a funeral pyre on the desert sand. That day, Luigi Pascucci and his crew gave their lives in a dramatic charge, one that is still remembered and etched Pascucci's name into history. It did not change the outcome of El Alamein, but it gave Alliata the chance to retreat and proved that courage can make even the weakest weapons matter. A relic of steel, a doomed engine's roar, a last charge into history. Thank you for watching that segment. It was a documentary drama short and is on the channel as a standalone video as well. I have to be honest, there is not a lot of information about this action that took place during the Second Battle of El Alamein. Most sources, and there have been Italian ones that I've translated, just summarise what happened between Pascucci's company of tanks and the oncoming 8th Armoured Brigade. I will have to make some assumptions on what happened as we take a tactical look. Most sources claim that Pascucci and his company were able to hold the left flank and launch a counter-attack that sent the 8th Armoured Brigade into disarray and causing serious losses. To do this, he had to get in close to the British tanks without being destroyed on approach. This was different to the usual approach of holding defensive lines during the later campaign for the Carro M tanks. Luigi Pascucci's counter-attack against the British Armoured Brigade near Bir el Abed, just west of El Alamein in November 1942, stands as a striking example of tactical audacity despite numerical and technical disadvantage. Leading a company of 11 M1340 tanks, Pascucci found himself outnumbered and faced with obsolescent vehicles against the more powerful British M3 Grants and Shermans. According to available accounts, Pascucci used the desert terrain and inherent environmental conditions to his advantage, turning the tables during a critical phase of the Trieste Division's retreat. The sandy ground and the dust clouds generated by advancing tanks became natural camouflage for Pascucci's forces. Utilising this obscuration, Pascucci's company staged a sudden and aggressive charge directly at the centre of the British armoured formation, specifically targeting command tanks whose destruction could induce confusion and disrupt British leadership and coordination. This bold strike created disarray within the British ranks, breaking their line and forcing a retreat. Pascucci's tactic to close in fast was deliberate. By getting within close range and flanking tanks with heavier frontal armour, such as Shermans and Grants, his forces maximised the effectiveness of their normally inadequate 47mm guns, which struggled against strong frontal armour but could penetrate side and rear armour more easily. The use of terrain and dusk to mask this manoeuvre was crucial, allowing Pascucci's tanks to bypass the enemy's frontal firepower advantage. Despite the tactical success of this daring counter-attack, the historical sources are sketchy and lack full details about the specific number of British tanks lost. What is clear is that Luigi Pascucci was killed in the course of the fighting and his company was ultimately destroyed in the engagement. His ultimate sacrifice and leadership bought crucial time, allowing the Trieste Division to withdraw more safely. This episode underscores the power of aggressive leadership, terrain utilisation and tactical innovation even when facing superior enemy armour and technology. Pascucci's attack is emblematic of how inferior tanks could delay or disrupt stronger forces through surprise, coordination and bold action, reinforcing the theme that battlefield success often depends on factors beyond machines alone. At the heart of any tank's effectiveness is not just the machine itself, but the crew and, most crucially, the commander. The crew forms a tightly knit unit where each member's skill, coordination and resilience under pressure directly influence the tank's performance in battle. These crews form a bond of trust, a close group that knows each other's personalities, duties and capabilities. The commander, as the central figure, must simultaneously maintain situational awareness, make rapid orders, manage coordination with other units, and inspire confidence within the crew. Tank warfare during World War II demanded extraordinary concentration and teamwork under extreme conditions. The claustrophobic, noisy and sweltering environment inside the tank was as much a test of endurance as the external threat of enemy fire. The commander needed to maintain constant vigilance, interpreting limited visual information through narrow periscopes, communicating orders clearly over the roar of engine and battle noise, and making split-second tactical decisions that could mean life or death for the crew and success or failure of the mission. Good leadership could compensate for technical shortcomings, inspire bold manoeuvres and exploit tactical opportunities that raw firepower alone could not. For inferior tanks confronting better armed opponents, the commander's decisiveness, tactical acumen and ability to synchronise actions within combined arms formations often made the critical difference, turning potentially obsolete machines into effective weapons. This was evident in numerous North African engagements, where leaders like Luigi Pascucci or other Italian and German tank commanders maximised their chances through bold leadership and efficient use of terrain and supporting arms. Their crew's discipline, persistence and trust in one another often define the thin margin between destruction and survival. Ultimately, the human factor remains the most crucial aspect of armoured warfare. No tank fights itself, and it is the qualities of its men that determine its fate on the battlefield. Approximately 252 Sherman tanks were rushed to North Africa prior to the Second Battle of El Alamein and formed a crucial part of the British 8th Army Armoured Brigades. During the intense fighting, there were significant Sherman tank losses. Total tank losses, including all types during the Second Battle of El Alamein, ranged widely in sources but are estimated at 332 to 500 tanks destroyed or abandoned for the Allies, compared to around 500 tanks for the Axis. The Axis forces may have been decimated and forced to retreat after the battle, but it cost the Allies a lot in tanks. Specific numbers of Shermans destroyed by German or Italian forces are not precisely separated in the records. Generally, the German 88mm anti-tank guns and tanks were the primary threat, with Italians providing heavy gun support mostly in static or mobile 90mm gun rolls, and less so in tank-on-tank battles because of the M1340's inferiority. Shermans were also lost due to minefields, mechanical breakdowns and concentrated artillery barrages during the artillery-heavy offensive. The Italians, facing the superior Sherman tank, adapted by deploying mobile heavy anti-tank weapons using truck-mounted 90mm cannons. The 9053 guns, often mounted on versatile robust truck platforms like the Lancia 3 Row and Breda 52, were the Italian counterpart to the German 88mm. This mobility allowed Italian forces to reposition rapidly, setting up long-range ambushes and defensive lines against advancing Shermans. While not as heavily armoured as dedicated tank destroyers, these truck-mounted 90mm guns compensated with firepower and flexibility, providing crucial support to weaker Italian medium tanks like the M1340. This tactical use of truck-mounted heavy guns formed an important part of the Italian response at battles such as El Alamein, complementing German 88mm equipped units in combined arms efforts in delaying and damaging Allied armoured thrusts. The Italians also relied on a network of artillery, including 75mm and 105mm guns, to provide indirect fire support and emergency anti-tank defence. Armoured reconnaissance vehicles like the AB-41 armoured cars played a crucial role in spotting targets and coordinating fire. For direct fire engagements, the Semovente de 7518 was far more effective than M1340s and M1441s. While Shermans showed superior overall battlefield effectiveness, they still suffered notable losses at El Alamein, chiefly from German combined arms actions, including the prominent 88mm guns, with supplemented Italian heavy anti-tank gun support. No clear division of kills between German and Italian forces is recorded in detail. Despite being increasingly outclassed in firepower and armour protection, inferior tanks like the Italian M1340s and M1441s could still achieve success on the battlefield. Their effectiveness hinged on tactical ingenuity, numerical coordination and combined arms support, rather than pure technological superiority. These tanks operated in an environment where terrain, surprise and well-executed manoeuvres could tip the balance in their favour. Their crews leveraged ambush tactics, defensive lines and encircling manoeuvres, turning otherwise outdated machines into serious challenges for better armed Allied tanks such as M3 Grants and Shermans. The example of the Semovente de 7518 working alongside M1340s and gun trucks, or the mass attacks by the 101st Motorised Division Trieste, illustrates how even obsolete tanks could impose costly losses on their adversaries. The indispensable support of heavier anti-tank weapons like the German 88mm guns and the critical coordination with the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica created a combined arms synergy that compensated for individual vehicle shortcomings. This integration underscored the operational principle that battlefield success derives not solely from hardware, but from the effective fusion of tactics, terrain, firepower, and coordination. Thus, the North African campaign vividly demonstrates that inferior tanks, perhaps by now seen as relics, remained vibrant and lethal instruments of war when wielded with skill, adaptability, and combined arms cooperation. Their continued threat reinforces the theme that obsolescence on paper did not equate to irrelevance on the battlefield. This nuanced understanding of armoured warfare enriches our grasp of how tactical and strategic ingenuity can empower even outdated machines to exert influence in combat.